There are wars that don't begin with explosions, but with signals only those who've watched long enough can recognize. When an aircraft carrier leaves port in silence, when dozens of fighter jets take off without a press release, when defense systems are set up before the first bullet is fired, that's when the world inches dangerously close to a red line. The Middle East today is standing at just such a moment. And in the next 72 hours, a single decision could reshape the entire regional landscape. If you want to truly understand what's happening behind the brief headlines, subscribe to this channel now, because deep analysis always begins before history gets around to naming it. There are moments in history not marked by the sound of explosions or blazing headlines, but by an eerie and suspicious silence. No declaration of war, no speeches before Congress, no ultimatums read before the cameras, just terse, dry statements, grainy photos hastily shared on military monitoring forums, and unmarked flights slipping off the runway in the dead of night, quietly, as if they never existed. When the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group entered the Middle East, Washington didn't say it was preparing to strike Iran. But in geopolitics, what isn't said often carries far more weight than what is declared openly. That silence isn't a lack of information, it's a signal, a kind of power language only those fluent in reading between the lines can truly understand. A strange phrase suddenly appeared near the Capitol: "If you sow the wind, you will reap the whirlwind." That's not a campaign slogan, nor your average diplomatic warning. It's an ancient line, breathing with the tone of scripture, the kind used in conflicts where there's no gray area, where the outcome often comes down to two extremes: total victory or complete collapse. In today's tense climate, that phrase is no longer symbolic, it's a cold implication. While public debate continues over whether this is deterrence or just a show of force, civil and military flight data tell a different story, a more detailed, harder to deny one. Dozens of KC-135 and KC-46A refueling tankers are showing up along familiar routes. Strategic airlifters, C-17s and C-5Ms, are crossing the Atlantic in succession. F-15Es are departing from Europe, British Typhoons are entering the region, and offshore, a naval formation equipped to launch dozens of land attack cruise missiles is quietly locking into position. This isn't the picture of ceremonial deterrence. This is the architecture of a preset battle formation, where every piece has a defined location and a clear purpose. A formation that may stay dormant for a long time, but once activated, will move at a pace no side can keep up with. Which is why the real question now is no longer, will the US strike Iran? The real question is, what kind of war is Washington preparing for? A limited punitive strike to send a message, or a deeper, more extended scenario, one powerful enough to shake the foundations of Tehran's power structure? To answer that, we have to look beyond diplomatic statements and focus on the one thing in warfare that can't be disguised: force deployment movements. Because when the machinery of war begins to move at an unusual scale, it usually speaks more truthfully than any speech. And it's from those signs that the picture behind the silence is slowly coming into view. In the military world, there are movements that simply can't be hidden, not because there's a lack of effort to disguise them, but because their scale is far too massive to be brushed off with harmless labels like rotations or routine exercises. When dozens of strike fighters depart Araf Lakenheath at unusual hours, all heading toward the Middle East in unison, that's no longer the story of a standard deployment. It's a strategic signal, one not meant for the public, but for the command staffs monitoring every flight path on their operational maps. This squadron is no stranger to Iran. They're not newcomers getting familiar with the terrain. These are pilots who've previously faced Iranian drones and missiles in large-scale attacks, who understand how the enemy runs its air defense systems, how fast it reacts, and what lies behind the tough rhetoric. When such battle-tested units are brought back into the region, the message is crystal clear. Washington isn't looking to experiment, it's looking to control the risks. Even the destination speaks louder than any press release. Muwafaq Salti Air Base, deep inside Jordanian territory, rarely makes headlines. It's not symbolic, and it's not for show. But geographically and militarily, it's a prime location, close enough to strike strategic targets inside Iran, yet far enough to avoid immediate retaliatory strikes in the opening minutes. In modern warfare, the choice of base is also the choice of scenario. Alongside the fighters is an unusually dense wave of refueling and heavy transport aircraft. These tankers aren't flying solo. They move in formation, along corridors once used in past long-range operations. In the language of air power, the number and tempo of refueling flights is a direct measure of a campaign's ambition. Missions that stretch thousands of kilometers and last for hours in the air aren't designed for symbolic strikes. They're built to sustain pressure over and over until the opponent is worn down. The strategic transport planes aren't carrying the image of a quick in-and-out operation either. They're loaded with ammunition, spare parts, maintenance equipment, and the capacity to absorb losses if the conflict drags on. In every major U.S. campaign, logistics has been the least flashy element, but the one that decides everything. When the logistical stream is widened from the outset, it signals that Washington isn't ruling out any scenario. If the goal were mere deterrence, the U.S. could have stopped at a few symbolic deployments. But here, everything exceeds the minimum. This formation is equipped not only to strike, but also to defend, absorb counterattacks, and keep fighting. That's the configuration of a real confrontation, not a show of force meant to sway diplomacy. And now that the pieces in the air and on the ground are in place, one key element is still missing to complete the battle formation. Because in every major conflict scenario, there's one foundation that allows the U.S. to maintain absolute freedom of action, even if land bases come under threat. That foundation isn't in the desert, it's at sea, and it's right there that the aircraft carrier begins to reveal its true meaning. In every military crisis involving the United States, the aircraft carrier is always the first image to appear in the media. But if we see the carrier only as a symbol of power, we'll miss the most dangerous meaning behind its presence. The USS Abraham Lincoln didn't come to the Middle East to show the flag. It arrived as a strategic launch pad, something that gives Washington more operational scenarios than any land base ever could. An aircraft carrier is not just a ship. It's a fully functioning, self-sustaining, mobile airbase. And most importantly, it exists without needing anyone's permission. In a region where every runway on land is tied to sovereignty, domestic politics, and diplomatic red lines, the carrier gives the U.S. what it always seeks in modern warfare: absolute freedom of action. On its deck, squadrons can launch at any hour in any direction with a level of flexibility no fixed base can match. While land bases may face threats from ballistic missiles, kamikaze drones, or political pressure from host nations, the carrier remains offshore, quietly maintaining operational tempo. It needs no overland supply lines. It's not dependent on a local government's stability. It stands as an independent anchor in the open sea. More important still is what comes with the carrier. The escorting destroyers aren't just there for defense. They carry high-precision cruise missiles capable of striking command centers, radar installations, and critical military infrastructure within the first hours of conflict. In that scenario, the carrier isn't the only spearhead. It's the core that enables the entire campaign to function smoothly. Zooming out, the carrier's presence also serves another purpose. It's the contingency plan for any failure on land. If a base is hit, if a country revokes airspace access, if a logistics corridor is disrupted, the carrier remains. And as long as it's there, the U.S. retains control of the war's rhythm. That's why the arrival of the USS Abraham Lincoln isn't a sign that war is certain. It's a sign that Washington is preparing for the worst. They're not betting on a swift surgical strike. They're laying the groundwork to fight long, fight deep, and endure the enemy's fiercest counterblows. But there's a paradox in modern warfare. To have the will to strike decisively, the prerequisite doesn't lie in offensive weapons, it lies in defensive readiness. No nation will escalate a conflict if it believes the first counterstrike could inflict uncontrollable damage. And that is precisely why, in parallel with the carrier offshore, a dense defensive network is quietly being constructed on land. Because when a superpower begins investing seriously in how to take a hit, that's often the most dangerous moment in any confrontation. In every war preparation, the weapons that grab the most attention are usually the offensive ones. But for military planners, the most worrying signs often lie in areas that get far less spotlight. the layers of defense. When the United States begins densely deploying air defense and missile defense systems across the Middle East, it's not a reactive gesture. It's a carefully calculated strategic decision. The Patriot missile systems and THAAD batteries aren't brought to the battlefield just for self-protection in the conventional sense. These are expensive, complex systems that require time to deploy and integrate. No nation spends billions of dollars, mobilizes elite personnel, and accepts political risk just to prepare for a quick in-and-out strike. Defense at this scale has one purpose: to instill confidence that no matter how strong the enemy's counterattack, it will remain within acceptable limits. In modern warfare, the ability to absorb a blow is the prerequisite for delivering one. When Washington sets up a multi-layered defensive shield, it's sending an unspoken message: we've accounted for day 2, day 3, even week 2 of the conflict. That mindset is far removed from the logic of a limited punitive strike, which relies on surprise and rapid resolution. This shield isn't just for American troops. It covers key bases, logistical hubs, and allied infrastructure, especially that of Israel. After previous waves of missile and drone attacks, Tel Aviv knows all too well the price of letting interceptor stockpiles run dry. The U.S. reinforcing its defenses signals a clear intent to prevent that scenario from repeating itself in a larger, fiercer conflict. There's a crucial detail often overlooked. Defense isn't only about preventing physical damage, it's also about psychological control. A society that believes it's well protected is willing to accept greater risks. An alliance that feels it can withstand a counterattack becomes more willing to take bolder steps on the strategic board. When the U.S. invests seriously in safeguarding its rear and its allies, it expands its own decision-making space. But this is also where the danger line begins to blur. Because once one side believes it's safe enough to take a hit, the other is forced to rethink how to respond. To Iran, the message from America's defensive network isn't a call for restraint. It's a sign that Washington is mentally prepared for escalation. From Tehran's point of view, if the adversary is ready to withstand retaliation, then limited responses lose their deterrent power. A missile that's intercepted creates no political impact. A retaliatory strike that's neutralized doesn't shift the balance of power. And when familiar pressure tools stop working, the remaining options narrow to 2: escalate harder or retreat in a weakened position. That's why America's construction of a dense defensive shield doesn't make the Middle East safer. It makes every calculation sharper, colder, more decisive. When both sides believe they're prepared for the worst-case scenario, the space for limited strikes and half measures begins to shrink rapidly. And from that moment on, the story no longer revolves around who strikes first or where the attack happens. It shifts to a much more dangerous question: is there still a line between punishment and full-scale war? For Iran, the answer seems to be coming into focus. In Iran's response this time, there's been a subtle but extremely dangerous shift. Gone are the familiar ambiguous statements, the usual phrases like proportional response or within the framework of deterrence. In their place are blunt, cold declarations, issued almost in unison from both official and semi-official channels. Any U.S. strike, no matter how limited, will be considered all-out war. This isn't an emotional threat, it's a doctrinal shift. For years, Tehran operated in the gray zone of geopolitics. They retaliated, but never crossed the threshold. They escalated, but always left an exit. Proxy strikes, indirect attacks, carefully calculated missile displays, all were designed to send a message without forcing the enemy to choose between war and capitulation. It was a delicate balancing act that Iran had mastered. But this time, that art seems no longer sufficient. The reason lies in how Tehran reads Washington's moves. When an adversary doesn't just deploy offensive forces but also seriously invests in defense, the message Iran receives isn't show restraint, it's we're ready for the worst. In Iran's security logic, that means the US is no longer aiming for a symbolic punitive strike. And if the enemy has crossed that line of preparation, then half measures become meaningless. That's why Tehran is now erasing the line between limited strikes and total war. Not because it wants war, but because it believes that only the highest level threat can deter one. A small counterstrike will be intercepted, a controlled response will be absorbed, But a vow to escalate fully forces the adversary to weigh the political and strategic costs on a much higher level. That message isn't just for Washington, it's aimed at the entire region. Iran has warned Middle Eastern nations that allowing the US to use their territory, airspace, or bases amounts to placing themselves on Iran's target list. This is how Tehran expands the psychological battlefield, turning every US logistical move into a political dilemma for governments across the region. Every runway, every base, every supply corridor now carries the risk of dragging its host nation into the vortex of conflict. But it's here that Iran's dilemma becomes most visible. By declaring that limited strikes no longer exist, they're also locking themselves out of the flexible options that once helped them avoid war. A maximum level threat only works if the adversary believes it will be acted upon. And once that belief takes hold, every incident, every miscalculation can trigger an uncontrollable spiral. More notably, recent statements from Tehran are no longer centered on protecting a nuclear site or responding to a specific airstrike. The focus has shifted to regime survival, national sovereignty, and rejecting coercion through military force. When the language moves from interests to existence, the space for compromise nearly disappears. And it's that shift that makes the picture more frightening. Because if Iran believes the US is no longer aiming for a symbolic punishment, but is building capacity to cripple the regime entirely, then Tehran's every move will follow a survival logic. From that moment on, it's no longer about who wins a battle, it's about who remains standing after the earthquake. When limited strikes no longer exist in Iran's thinking, the rest of the picture forces us to confront what Washington is truly preparing for. Not a warning shot, not a symbolic punishment, but a capability powerful enough to change the game at the regime level, whether or not the political decision to use it is ever made. When all the pieces are assembled, from long-range strike fighters, offshore aircraft carriers, cruise missiles, multi-layered defense networks to a logistics stream widened from the outset, the resulting picture no longer resembles a conventional punitive operation. This is a force structure built to do far more, to cripple a state, dismantle the operational core of a regime, and push the adversary into disarray within the first critical days. What stands out is the absence of ground troops. There are no signs of mass amphibious landings, no convoys of tanks rolling deep into enemy territory. But this isn't a sign of restraint. In modern warfare, infantry is no longer a prerequisite for toppling a government. Power grids, communications, command and control systems, finance, and public confidence, these are the real pillars of a state. And when they are taken down simultaneously, a government can collapse far faster than through any traditional invasion. The way the US is building its posture reflects exactly that logic. Precision strikes aren't aimed at symbols, they're targeting the nervous system of the regime. Command centers are disrupted, radar networks blinded, communication channels suffocated. When a government can no longer see, hear, or issue orders effectively, the number of missiles or soldiers it still has on paper becomes largely irrelevant. In that context, America's serious investment in defensive capabilities further clarifies its strategic intent. They're not just preparing to strike, they're preparing to strike while withstanding the counterblows. That's the fundamental difference between a symbolic punishment and regime change capability. Punishment relies on surprise and a swift exit. Regime change depends on the ability to sustain pressure until the enemy loses the capacity to function. On the other side, Iran fully understands this message. Tehran doesn't interpret Washington's moves as a lesson-teaching maneuver. They see a structure designed to be activated in stages, escalated in a controlled fashion, and prolonged long enough to erode the regime's foundations from within. That's why Iran's rhetoric has shifted from interest to survival, from deterrence to existential stakes. The political dimension is inseparable from this military equation. Leaked reports suggest that Donald Trump has asked for options that go beyond pressure, options capable of causing a rapid collapse of Tehran's ruling system should the order be given. Even if the final command hasn't been signed, in strategic planning, capability deployment always precedes decision. Once the tools are in place, the distance between calculation and action becomes dangerously short. There's a terrifying paradox in moments like this. The more thoroughly the preparation, the higher the risk force will be used. Not because either side wants war, but because when every option is ready, the pressure to not let that readiness go to waste begins to build. A formation built to change the game is rarely left idle forever. And that's why the most dangerous part of the story isn't any specific airstrike, it's the capability already sitting on the table. When punishment is no longer the ultimate goal, when the force structure allows for the collapse of an entire system, every political decision becomes historically weighty. There's no need for a declaration of war, no need for loud warnings, just a single concise order, and the region could enter an entirely new chapter. In this context, the question is no longer whether the US wants regime change in Iran. The far scarier question is, now that the capability exists and every condition has been set, is there still enough space left to turn back? The next 72 hours pass under an unusually heavy atmosphere. Oil markets fluctuate not because of something that has happened, but because of fear over what might happen. America's allies issue calls for restraint, but their voices grow quieter, as if they themselves sense those appeals are losing their power. In Tehran, centers of power move into high alert, and the United States remains silent, a silence far heavier than any bold declaration. In geopolitics, silence is rarely a void. It's often the final phase of calculation. When every supply line has been opened, every shield has been raised, every launch pad put into place, words become redundant. All that's left is the decision. And whether that decision is made or not, it will leave a lasting mark. The next 72 hours may pass without a single shot fired. No glowing satellite images, no emergency alerts, no named operation. But even in that scenario, the Middle East will not return to the way it was. Because the very fact that the capability to alter the balance of power was laid on the table is enough to change how every nation in the region thinks about security, alliances, and dependence. And if, during those 72 hours, an order is given, the consequences won't be limited to a bilateral clash. It will ripple across the region, trigger new calculations among global powers, shake energy supply chains, and usher in a period of instability with no clear endpoint. The Middle East then won't just be witnessing another war, it will be experiencing a reshaping of the power order, where old boundaries blur and new rules are written by force. Sobering truth is this: decisive moments like these are rarely recognized for what they are while they're unfolding. History usually names them after the consequences have arrived. But for those watching every move today, the sense of a turning point, one that cannot be undone, is unmistakable. The world stands at a crossroads, and whether the choice is action or restraint, the price will be steep. If you followed the story this far, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the US is still posturing or preparing for something deeper in Iran? Can war still be avoided, or has the Middle East already crossed the point of no return? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep, measured, and unhyped analysis, because some wars don't begin with a bang, but with long, silent hours like these.